Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Professor Brendan McCane, and I'm the Associate Dean Academic for the Division of Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this CALT Kōrero on the subject of generative AI models and such as ChatGPT. And we're going to look at the effects that these models are likely to have on the future for the academy and for society a bit more widely. Before I introduce our panelists today, I thought I'd just mention a few things about me, just to establish my credentials. I was born and raised in Ireland and pursued undergraduate studies at Trinity College, Dublin, graduating in 1978 at age 8, and a PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Edinburgh, graduating in 1982, age 12. I've worked for several years in the UK and US and joined Otago in 1992. I was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand in 2006. I have received the University of Otago's Distinguished Research Medal, the New Zealand Association of Scientists Research Medal, and the IEEE Computer Society's Outstanding Contribution Award. At least that's what ChatGPT wrote about me, and of course none of that is actually true. But it was a very plausible summary, and I've pinned that up on my notice board, and that's what I'm going to be aiming for from now on. Okay, let me introduce the panel. In the middle we've got Lech Szymanski.
Kia ora everyone, my name is Lech, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Computer Science Department here at the university. And my research interests are in machine learning and specifically in deep learning methods. And some of my work is building those models, and the last one I worked on was something that had to recognize sheep faces from images. But my main interest is theoretical understanding of the way artificial neural networks, which power all of the deep learning, how they work, why they work so well when they do, and why sometimes they fail so badly.
Okay, thanks Lech. And on the end we've got Grant Dick.
Kia ora. So yes, I am an Associate Professor and Head of Department of Information Science here at the University of Otago. I teach and research in the areas of artificial intelligence and evolutionary computation. My main focus is in theoretical evolutionary computation, but I do put a little bit of emphasis on applied research, currently in the area of aquaculture. My main interest outside of that in terms of artificial intelligence is more on the application side of things, and I tend to approach these things with a skeptical first view, shall we say, and prove me right, or prove me wrong, shall we say. So hopefully that will inform things as we go along today.
Okay, thanks Grant. And right next to me we've got James Maclaurin.
Kia ora, e homa. I'm James Maclaurin. I'm a philosopher at the University of Otago. I'm co-director of the university's Centre for Artificial Intelligence and Public Policy, and my research focused on AI has been mostly focused on the effect of AI on jobs and work, and on government use of AI in Aotearoa. I'm also co-author of a book called A Citizen's Guide to Artificial Intelligence.
Okay, thanks James, and this is our panel. All right, so just to give you a quick overview for this panel session, we're going to have each of our panelists give brief outlines of a particular topic related to AI models, and then there might be a little bit of interchange from the panel, sort of Q&A up here, and then at the end of the session there should be 10 or 20 minutes left over for Q&A from the audience. So Lech's going to tell us a little bit about the technical overview, give us a bit of a technical overview of ChatGPT. Grant's going to give his views on where these AI models are heading in the short, medium and long term. James is going to chat about what this means for society, government and business, and the world of work. And I'm going to wrap up with some thoughts on what it means for assessment, especially at universities. So we'll see how we go. Okay, for our first panelist chat, over to you, Lech. Tell us how ChatGPT works.
Thanks, Brendan. Right, so my job is to explain a little bit about what ChatGPT is and how it works. So ChatGPT is a chatbot. It generates text in response to your written queries. And the reason why we're talking about it is because it's really, really good, to the point where we have a hard time distinguishing what it produces from human writing. And this is all thanks to an artificial neural network sitting inside ChatGPT, which has been trained to mimic text patterns from a massive data set of documents taken from internet, Wikipedia, and book repositories. But for most users, I think the most useful thing to know about is how ChatGPT works after it has been trained. And so to explain that, I'm going to use an analogy. So imagine a device, kind of like a calculator, but with 50,000 buttons on it. And each button has a different word. So you can punch in any sentence by punching a special correct sequence of buttons. And that device also has a predict button. So after you punch a sequence as an input, you can press predict, and the device will give you the probability distribution of what word should follow. And the way it communicates that is by lighting up all the buttons, the same buttons that are used to punch in the input sequence, with different brightness of light. And the brighter the light, the more confident the device is that this is a correct word that should follow whatever has been input before. And ChatGPT essentially operates that device for you. So when you input a text query, ChatGPT takes it, it punches that query into the device, it presses the predict button, the buttons light up, and ChatGPT picks one of those buttons at random, but from the few most bright ones, punches it again, and that gets added to the input sequence, and punches predict again, and then the next word comes up. The lights change now because the prediction of what follows is different because now the input sequence has been changed, and this keeps going on and on until a special light comes on that says, I'm done, there's nothing more to generate, and ChatGPT returns all the text to you. That's essentially how it works, and the artificial neural network that sits inside is essentially that device. The last few things that I want to point out is that that for the purpose, when you interact with ChatGPT, the network has been trained, and all the circuitry of that device are fixed. So it doesn't change as you chat with it. It doesn't learn anything new, and every output is the same, given the same input. The reason why it generates different text is because it doesn't always pick that brightest button that is the most likely word to follow, but it picks at random one from the few brighter ones. And the reason why it's so good is because that circuitry is capable of finding partial patterns even in sentences that it hasn't seen before. So if there's a new input that it hasn't seen before, it can latch on to partial patterns and combine them in interesting ways and generate text that we find meaningful and often correct. And that's pretty much it. ChatGPT is a marvel of neural network engineering, but essentially when it operates, it's that device that just generates text.
So it's a little bit like autocomplete.
It's essentially like a very sophisticated autocomplete, except the autocomplete that we have in our phones probably looks at the last few letters that you typed in, maybe the previous word. This one can look up to 2,000 words of the conversation, and from that get the context of the conversation.
So just to give the audience a little bit of an idea, how big is this database?
Right. So we don't know the exact numbers. All these are estimates because OpenAI, who made ChatGPT, didn't release those numbers. But it's estimated that the data set of the documents that has been trained on has had around 500 gigabytes, which doesn't sound like a big number, but you have to remember that it's all text. So the entire English Wikipedia, the text of the entire English Wikipedia is about 20 gigabytes. So this was 500 gigabytes. And so I think it's estimated that to train ChatGPT, it was passed, around 300 billion words were passed through it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so to put that in context, how many words do we come across
in
our lives?
Right.
Approximately?
So so we did that. We did that computation. So if I think the computer, if I remember the computation correctly, if you were processing a word every second for 10 hours of your day, and so in your entire lifetime, you would process about 10 million words, if I got that correctly. So that's sort of the scale.
And so you said ChatGPT is really big. How big?
So ChatGPT is known to have 175 billion parameters, which might not mean a lot to a lot of people. To me, it means that it's a really huge neural network that I can run on my computer. But we know it took roughly 10,000 GPUs to train it. That's a huge computational power. And so if you try to train ChatGPT on your PC, it will take about 300 years. But with the 10,000 GPUs, it took about a month. That's the estimate. So that's how big that model is.
So in terms of what it's supposed to do, it's fair to say it's not supposed to give you the truth. It's trying to just converse. It's trying to give you likely conversations rather than aiming to give you true conversations. It just so happens that it gives you true conversations.
Correct.
Mostly.
It's just falls back on the patterns that it recognizes, and it's just based on those patterns, it predicts what should follow. And because the data has been curated very carefully to make sure that there's that this is a useful data and so on, and therefore most of the time it will say true things, but equally well, just like in Brendan's bio, it can just find patterns that kind of sound like they should be right, but they're not.
Okay. Thanks, Lech. Grant, where are we going?
Thank you, Brendan. The old cliche of there's a Danish proverb that predicting the future is, well, predicting is difficult, especially about the future. So I don't know why I volunteered to answer this question, but here we go. As Lex alluded to, these language models that we're using in these domains are very large and very complex, to the point where we know that they work, but we don't necessarily know how they work. So there's ongoing research, and it'll probably be a flurry of research in the next 12 months and going forward around how do we understand these models better, okay, so that we can remove the degree of randomness that's in there, or we can understand why certain decisions were made around what words were selected and so forth. Okay. We know enough about them to control them to some degree, so that we can control how they're used and to shape the answers they provide, but we don't necessarily understand the deep theoretical underpinnings of them. These large neural networks are often engineered, not necessarily built up from really deep first principles. Okay. That sounds scarier than it actually is, potentially. The other thing that Lech alluded to is that there are 175 billion parameters in ChatGPT. The next model will obviously be even bigger. If it's bigger, it's going to require more data. So it's going to require more than 500 gigabytes of data to train. So that means we're going to need bigger models that are going to require more computation. So we're going to be relying on bigger data centers. That inevitably has environmental impact. These data centers often don't run on renewable sources. So we have environmental impact in terms of fuel that's burnt to run these data centers and so forth. So we need to focus a bit of research and concentration on how to make these things a little bit more energy efficient, both in the inference that they give and actually in their training. The next thing that we're going to see, and we are already seeing, and we'll probably talk about this quite a bit over the next few minutes, is that these technologies, you don't necessarily have to go to ChatGPT and enter your queries in there and take the result and put it into your assignment or put it into your work that you're doing here. These technologies, these language models, are being integrated into the tools that we use daily. Okay? You're about to see, and Bing Search, the Microsoft search engine, actually has released a preview of this now, and you can sign up for early adoption. You're going to see these tools being integrated into the things that we use day in, day out. Possibly even to the point where it's transparent. You don't necessarily fully understand that you're actually using them. So from an academic perspective and from various other perspectives, we need to think about how we actually embrace that. Okay? We can't even necessarily assume that a student, if they're going to plagiarize, for example, is doing this dishonestly. If they are using those legitimate tools out there, they may be honestly using these these techniques and not necessarily realizing it. So we need to work around that. I guess the last thing I want to say is that I'm going to make a really bold prediction here. 12 months from now, we won't be talking about ChatGPT. Okay? The hype will have moved on, we will understand it a lot better, and the fear and the uncertainty will have moved to something else that we're using. Okay? We're going to have various techniques that are going to make it clearer that these sources of text are going to be generated from ChatGPT or various other language models, because there's quite a lot of work going into watermarking them and understanding that the particular sequence that they generate to make it clear that it's come from a language model. Now, that's not necessarily done for an academic benefit or anything that we may be concerned about. The companies that build these models are actually concerned about it for the very specific reason that they don't want to train their models on language model generated text, because it's kind of not really expanding its horizon to be learning on its own regurgitations, basically. So they've got a vested interest in producing it. Now, we may be able to leverage that, or it may be that we just don't worry about it too much and we focus on embracing these technologies a little bit more than fearing them and thinking they're going to be the end of the way that we teach. I think I'll leave it there.
So when is ChatGPT going to arrive in Microsoft Word?
Well, Office 365 does have a fairly rapid turnaround in terms of product updates and that sort of thing. So if we all remember Clippy, I wouldn't expect a ChatGPT variant of Clippy 6 months from now. But if you're on a preview release, I don't think it'd be too far to say 12 months from now you'll be seeing these kind of technologies embraced in there.
There is a demo of ChatGPT, or something like, I presume it's ChatGPT working with Excel.
Yes.
Where you can say, just in ordinary speech, strip out this from these cells and do this computation on, and it will then generate the formula that it pops in the cell. So, so that's coming.
Yeah. But in terms of an every day in, day out release, still a wee while away yet, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Grant. James, what's this mean?
Okay, so I want to talk about work and knowledge and humanity. Let's aim high. Okay, so we'll kick off with work. So the large language models that sit under things like ChatGPT that Lech was talking about are classic examples of general purpose technologies, and other examples of general purpose technologies are things like electricity and the production line and telephony. So they're technologies that have an extraordinary breadth of application, that are very, very disruptive commercially, that will have big effects on the way that people live and work. I agree, it's not going to be ChatGPT next year, but it'll be something else. It'll be the descendants of. So we're going to get lots of change. We're going to have our students trying to work out, having a laser focus on what sort of skills they think they need now in this world with this sort of technology in it. And we're going to have to try and help them, try and work out, what those skills are and how we can provide those skills for them. When people think about technology change, large-scale technology change, they immediately think about technological unemployment, and that's a term that was invented by John Maynard Keynes, the economist, writing in 1930. And Keynes says that technological unemployment is always a temporary phase of adjustment when you go from an old technology to a new technology. Now, there's always debate about it, but that's 1930. We've had a lot of automation from then to now. We still haven't seen large-scale structural unemployment in countries like ours. What we do see is massive change in the jobs that we do, differences in the skills required for particular jobs, the number of people doing particular jobs, obviously new jobs arising. Who knew what prompt engineering was last year? Now suddenly it's a job. With all that, you get a lot of change in the value of jobs that is output by that. So to give you a really old-fashioned example, 1922, the Ford Motor Company invents the moving production line, and suddenly they can pump out Model T Fords 3 times as fast. But they do so with a workforce that's largely unskilled. They don't need anything like as many engineers or mechanics. You just need people who can do one job on a production line. Satya Nadella, the current boss of Microsoft, says that ChatGPT is going to lower barriers to knowledge work. That sounds good. I like a low barrier. But if you think a little bit about what's being said here, what's being said is that some of the knowledge skills we have now are going to be less important, less valuable in future. That's his prediction. Is ChatGPT going to make us less knowledgeable? Let's go to ancient Greece. Why not? So Plato, very worried about new technologies that he thinks will make foolish people look wise. And the technology Plato's really worried about is writing. Because in the past, if you knew it, it was up here. And now all of a sudden you could know things that were out there. And the long history of knowledge innovation has been a history of us getting better at having knowledge that's out there. Putting it out there, retrieving it, searching it, manipulating it, all those sorts of things. So, in general, what this panoply of change has achieved is better retrieval of knowledge by more people. So a democratization of knowledge. People having more opportunity to learn more about more things, generally successfully. So we all know what the issues are, or what lots of the issues are here. So there's bias and accuracy, all those sorts of things. It's worth knowing that ChatGPT has what's called a trust and safety layer built into it. So that's a layer that's built by the people who make ChatGPT. That's making a decision about what sort of things ChatGPT wouldn't talk to us about and what sort of things it would talk to us about it. So it's curated a little bit like the way that your Facebook feed is curated by an algorithm. All right, humanity, last up. People are really excited about the fact that this seems so human in what it can do. And there are people who've claimed that, some of these models are conscious, that they have beliefs. But the flip side is people who say, it's an algorithm. It doesn't know things. Under the hood, it's just matrix multiplication. It doesn't have beliefs. Knowledge, belief, desire, autonomy, moral characteristics, moral agency, moral patiency. They're complex and contested ideas. But it's worth knowing that a lot of the theory in this space is what philosophers call thin. So to give you an example, here's a common way of thinking about belief. My beliefs are nothing more, my belief that there's milk in the fridge is nothing more than my tendency to go to the fridge when I need milk. It's just a disposition. It's whatever in me makes that true. That's a low bar. That's the sort of bar that ChatGPT could meet. Now, I'm not saying ChatGPT is conscious or it's a person or anything like this. There is going to be a lot of great fun, fascinating philosophical debate about these things. I think it's easy to get distracted by these issues and lose sight of the big thing, which is what ChatGPT can do for us. So one last example and I'll stop. So we live in a world where people live longer, much longer. And a consequence of that is an epidemic of loneliness around the world. Millions of people who have for companionship a pet or the radio or the TV, which can't engage with them, which can't answer their questions, can't help them, isn't on their side. Things like ChatGPT could be extraordinarily valuable to vast numbers of people. So they're here to stay.
Okay, thanks, James. I think one thing just to pull all of that together to make sure everybody's aware, ChatGPT and the tools like it are an example of what's known as narrow AI. So this is AI that's very good at a specific problem, and we've got lots of examples where narrow AI is absolutely excellent and often better than humans, but only in very, very narrow fields, and ChatGPT is an example of that. So it doesn't reason, right? It doesn't do reasoning like we think of reasoning.
What's reasoning? So
Well,
it's manipulating ideas. It can do inference. So if I'm good at prompting, I can say, imagine you're a philosophical logician and you want to analyze this argument, and it can analyze the argument in the way that a logician would analyze the argument. So it can mechanically do what we're doing when we're doing things like reasoning. Whether we want to call it reasoning, well, I can recommend lots of philosophy courses that you could take that might help. But it's not a simple question. It really isn't.
Well, Lech, Grant, what do you think about that statement?
Grant hates it.
It's quite,
Never go
quite
against a philosopher.
controversial. Quite a controversial statement from James, I think.
I think a very bold statement. It is. I agree that it's an application of narrow AI. It's a very useful application of narrow AI. I think, personally, if it was able to reason, it would, if you look at Brendan's profile about member of Royal Society and that sort of thing, it would know that this is a fabrication. And so we go, am I going to get this through? And, so I think that it's a clear demonstration that it is very useful probability distributions that present an image of intelligence.
Broader intelligence. One of the things with working out whether artificial intelligence is smart is what standards are that you use. So if you want to assess whether an automated vehicle is doing a good job, one thing that people get very excited about is it made a mistake that a person wouldn't make. So when it screws up, it doesn't screw up in the same way that we screw up. But actually what matters is the road toll. We care about how much it screws up. Now, these things are going to screw up in ways that we don't screw up. The question is, are they smarter than my Twitter feed? I don't know. There are some bits of my Twitter feed that look pretty weird. A reason to think that I guess we should be skeptical, and then another reason to think the other way. So some people say we should be skeptical because when I reason about, the mass of this glass, what it'll do if I touch it, something like that, my beliefs come from perceptions that I have of things like that. I'm connected with things like that, reasonably well, so they're grounded in the real world. Except that I can talk about plesiosaurs and things. I've never seen a plesiosaur. Some people have evidence for plesiosaur. They write it down. It gets to me eventually. So I do something that philosophers call reference borrowing. Now, a way to think about what ChatGPT is doing is that it only borrows reference, because it doesn't have any connection with the real world until somebody puts it inside a robot.
And I've just read a paper where somebody's done that. Okay, I think we'll leave that discussion, otherwise we'll be here all day. So thanks, James. Thanks to the panel. So I just wanted to briefly talk about what this means for assessment at university especially. And so I think, so the generative language cat is out of the bag and we're not putting it back in. So students will use these tools, whether we like it or not. So even if you have an assignment that explicitly says you must not use ChatGPT, there's going to be some percentage of students, and this would probably get higher as things go on, who will in fact use ChatGPT. So trying to get around not using ChatGPT is effectively a lost cause for those sorts of assessments where we send students away. They can go and do them at home, for example. This is not true. So if you want to actually make sure that a student is writing the thing that you're seeing now, then it has to be some sort of invigilated assessment. So an exam, an in-class test, an oral presentation, things like that. I know Grant talked briefly about that there'll be tools, and there are some tools out there now that can detect with a certain amount of success whether a piece of text was generated by ChatGPT or not. I don't think these things can be trusted. So in fact, this is often a way that the training of these sorts of models happen. There's a competition going on between the generator and a discriminator, right? And so you end up in an arms race. And eventually, ChatGPT or similar will become so good to be completely indistinguishable. So unless they explicitly put in things like watermarks from the start, we're not going to be able to tell. So what does that mean? So I think what it means is that we're going to have to think extremely carefully, and this will be very discipline specific, about what is the knowledge and the skills that the students need to have in their heads, and what are the knowledge and skills that students don't need to have in their heads but just need to be able to find somehow. And that's the key distinction. So if you're learning a language, clearly you need to have vocabulary and grammar in your head, otherwise you're not going to be able to speak. No good getting ChatGPT to generate it offline, although maybe we'll get a Babelfish at some point and it won't matter. But aside from that, quite often there's suggestions that questions that focus on higher order thinking or analysis are thought of as good questions. I suggest you try any of those questions out with ChatGPT or similar, if you have those. In my experience, ChatGPT is pretty good at answering those sorts of questions at an undergraduate level, at the sort of level that we expect our undergraduates to be thinking about. So I think one of the really good tips is, if you have an assessment question where a student can go home and do the assessment, then pass that question through ChatGPT just to see what sort of answers it can give you. And generally it's pretty good at answering well-known facts and doing sort of well-known analysis. It's not necessarily very accurate at choosing citations and things like that, so sometimes it gets those completely wrong. So a couple of other suggestions, and I thank Lee Adam for providing a document about this, which she's circulated around the university already. But setting assignments that require feedback from the teacher. So you set an assignment, they have to submit something, you provide feedback, they submit something else based on that. I think that's one good way. If you design personal reflections into your assessments, although ChatGPT can generate these too, so they need to be personal reflections that you sort of know something about the experience of the student. And also referring to material that's not easily available on the internet. So things that you discuss in class or have in your lecture notes, for example. Okay, so I think we're good. We're ready to take some questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes.
Just thought I'd throw something out there from the healthcare perspective of this. There's a few scientists who first, when they saw ChatGPT, thought, oh, what should we try and do with it? Let's see if it can pass the United States medical licensing exam. And it did. So there's a question of, is this thing going to replace the professionals we go to for knowledge quicker than we are expecting it's going to?
Does anyone want to I have an opinion, but...
Economists distinguish between enabling and replacing technologies. So my laptop enables me, and the checkout machine replaces a checkout operator in a supermarket. In reality, automation like this is always a mix of both those things. So it might be that in future we don't need as many GPs, but the GPs we have very whiz-bang technology at their sides that allow them to be much more reliable at giving you a diagnosis. Sorry, that's not much of an answer, but...
Yeah, so sorry, just so we have the question. Yeah, thanks, Richard. The question was about whether things like ChatGPT are going to replace professional people, whether that's in healthcare or similar, more quickly than we think might happen. Yeah. I think probably not. I think it will be used as a tool by the professionals. I mean, society moves relatively slowly.
And I think if you take that specific example of passing the exam, that's demonstrating an exam is, in many cases, including those kind of professions, an example of regurgitating fact. It's not a, in an exam environment, there's not going to be a lot of diagnosis kind of work going on and so forth. So yeah, these are technologies that would support those people in those places, and I think that's actually an important part of what we do in academia now. Is as Brendan alluded to, and I alluded to, we have code generators now that will work on with these language models. The code they generate is 98% right, but it'll be on those edge cases where it's wrong. And what we need to be training is not necessarily how to write code, but in some ways, how to recognize when code is wrong, or how to work through that process of refining that code that gets generated to make it work again. And again, it's an example of augmenting our abilities in the professions that we choose.
Yeah, and I think it's important, and that's a good example, I think, of what we think as one of the skills that a student must have. So in our discipline, they must be able to program, otherwise you can't call yourself really a computer scientist or an information scientist. And having a program generator doesn't really help, because you won't be able to recognise when it goes wrong. We've got a couple of questions from the Zoom, or wherever it's coming from, the ether, talking about non-STEM disciplines like humanities, etc. So what skills, essentially, do we think students will need to be able to make effective use of these chatbots? So how can we prepare our students for using these tools wisely? So what is it we need to do? Because guaranteed they're going to be using these, assuming there's no robot apocalypse, in their working lives. Anyone?
So in the humanities, actually I don't really think there's a different answer to the humanities for everybody else. I mean, prompt engineering is going to become a huge thing.
Yeah, what is prompt engineering?
So understanding how to interact with something like ChatGPT. People who use this for the first time put in a question, like an exam question. If it doesn't get it right, they go, it's bust. It's like you buy a hammer. Well, the nail didn't go in, this hammer's broken. There's a skill to it, so you need to tell it what domain it's in, you need to tell it what expertise you want it to have. You can tell it, answer this at a level that a 10-year-old would understand. So, that ability to make it give you the information you want, you can tell it to expand on things, to leave some stuff out. So that kind of prompt engineering, I think, is going to be really important. I think the bigger question for us is, what's the thing that people who do our jobs have to be able to do? So philosophers have to be able to do logic. People in the humanities, actually people everywhere in universities, have to be able to think critically. And critical thinking is the thing that it's screwing up when it's getting Brendan wrong and saying, he's probably king of the universe. I mean, you could be. I'm sorry, Brendan. But so critical that ability to think about how people would disagree with what you're saying and what you would say to them. It's the nuance. It's that sort of thing. Maybe there'll be a point where it can do that, but for now, that's the thing we need to have, so we can tell when it's getting things wrong and use it more effectively.
Yeah, so one sort of question here was, what about asking students to use ChatGPT and then analyse its response? I think they're excellent sort of
fantastic
questions. Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
I have a technical question, I think. Well, I have a number of questions. I'm amazed about how ChatGPT deals with different languages. So first I thought it's just the bigger languages it does, but it does even languages that Google Translate doesn't get really right. So it's really good at translating. So I asked ChatGPT, I was interested to know if it has been trained on those languages or if they just translated into English. And it gave me a long list of languages, which I thought, this is great, because actually it's not just all languages going through English, being that big monoculture of English, but it's actually drawing from different cultures. And my colleague in Japan put in exactly the same question, and she got as an answer, it's only English. So that's interesting because it was the same prompt, so it was interesting what you said. But I was wondering if you had any, between those two extremes of answers, if you had, so what is the corpus on, I mean, is it a multilingual corpus or is it just English and all the languages being through the lens of English?
I think it's...
So can I just make sure, is that being captured? Yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah. So I think it's trained on multilingual corpus, and I think, so as far as I know, ChatGPT doesn't have translation or anything like that in it. I think ChatGPT has a math engine now that it recognizes mathematical formulas and something else handles it, and not the language model. But as far as language, so when I gave that device, I simplified things. I said one button's a word. In fact, ChatGPT has fraction of text on those buttons. So putting this text together, it can make up pretty much any word there is out there, including weird characters from weird languages. And so, for instance, I tried Polish, and I looked how it tokenizes the sentence, and it doesn't go by words. It's just a couple of letters, 3 letters at a time, and that gets translated into numbers. And ultimately, ChatGPT just works with numbers, and it just recognizes those patterns. What is amazing about some of the internals is that those numbers also, that neural network makes those numbers in a way, so represents them internally, that there's relationships. So it has this representation that numbers for the same concept in different language, for the same concept coming from different text will sort of be pushed to the same point in the representation. So it can represent the same concept in any language. It just, whatever the context comes in, it just chooses the same context to come out. But it's the same mechanism, and from ChatGPT's point of view, it doesn't really matter how it comes out, and it takes the cue from your prompt how it has to come out. But it's internal representation. It's done in a way that it's words, regardless of the language, sort of fall to the same concepts internally, and therefore it can generate patterns. Even if it learns pattern in English, if the prompt is in Polish, it can use the pattern from English and output Polish sentence.
Okay, thanks, Lech. So a question from the ether. So how do we ensure that students are not falsely accused of using ChatGPT, as there is no way to prove it yet? So I think a simple answer to that is we need to design assessments so that even if they use ChatGPT, it's not academic misconduct. I mean, that's really the only, either we design them so that it's impossible to use ChatGPT, or we have an assessment where using ChatGPT is okay. I mean, I don't.
I think I'll just add on to that what I said before about we will reach a point where students may genuinely not know that they're using these tools. Okay, so it's we have to move on from a point of accusation to a point of genuinely, they're not falsely using them. They're not honestly using them. They're just part of their arsenal and suite of things that they use. Yeah.
So similar to like a spell checker or a grammar checker. Yeah. Nobody says now, oh, you've obviously used a grammar checker on that sentence.
Exactly.
You've done academic misconduct, right? So it's going to be, I think that the tool itself is in a similar category.
Well, it might end up being like something like calculators, where we just assume people have access to them and it's absolutely fine, but there might be contexts in which we say,
sure,
for kids at school, you can't use a calculator now. Yeah. So that's so it might be that.
Yeah, exactly.
And for those particular cases, we have very specific types of invigilation there. So we don't go walk behind the corridor and behind the wall there and do the equations. We say do it on the whiteboard or whatever. So. So we'd have to do something similar there. If it's something that's absolutely critical, that right there, right now, you have to demonstrate knowledge of something, then maybe our only solution is in-person invigilation there. And there's ways around that, absolutely. Yeah.
A question from the audience?
Hello. So 6 years ago, there was a documentary called AlphaGo. Maybe some people in the audience stand up there are familiar. For those who aren't familiar, the premise was there was a machine learning built to play the game of Go, and they demonstrated this tool at a championship where they had the world champion in Go play 5 rounds, and the machine learning beat the world champion, I think 4 out of the 5 games that were played. So part of what I took away from that documentary was the model AlphaGo was playing the game in a way that was different than how they'd noticed people play over all these, however many years, hundreds of years they've been playing the game of Go. So for you experts, what sorts of areas are you excited to see these predictive models move into that might teach us things that we don't previously know, or methods that we're not previously using? Whether it's language or other areas, is there anything that excites you in particular about illuminating new methods, I guess?
Well, not to parrot it back, but game playing is exactly that scenario where things are quite fascinating. We talk about, the classic thing is a chess grandmaster. We always, interview a chess grandmaster and say, how do you play chess? They won't even be able to tell you themselves how they play chess. But these upcoming technologies may actually uncover strategies that they use, may be able to mimic the behaviors of them. And increasingly, when we're moving towards looking at things like explainable AI, we may actually start to uncover what those strategies are and be able to actually codify what that knowledge is. That is very much tacit knowledge to those experts. So I see that as being one place where we progress at. Game playing, a lot of activities that we do as humans, we flat out just don't know why we do it or how we do it. And it's those places that we can, driving, for example. James alluded to the fact that we might be able to make ourselves safer at driving. Half the time, I am on autopilot when I'm driving home. Something's going on, something's happening. I'm turning, I'm indicating, and that sort of thing. Pretty much instinctually, maybe there's something in there that these AI techniques can use to help us understand my personal behaviour as an agent in this world.
For me, anywhere where there are really complex patterns, where it's very hard to do the science, often because it's very hard to do experiment. Medical diagnosis is going to be something like that. But also things like economics, where you just can't experiment on whole economies. So very multifactorial systems. I think we'll learn a lot.
I have two areas that I'm particularly excited about. One is the science and engineering area, I think. So we've recently had protein folding, which was using an AlphaGo-like AI, which has moved things along quite significantly in the protein folding space, but I think in material science and various other things like that, for designing things where you just need so much knowledge to be able to successfully do it that it's hard to fit it all in your head. So that's one thing. The other thing is I very much look forward to the day when ChatGPT or similar can fill out all the forms that I have to fill out. If it can do that, I'd be very happy.
So yeah, I just wanted to add that I don't think ChatGPT itself is gonna produce something creative or awesome because it's been really trained as a predictor. So I use it when I program. It helps me program, and I was curious if it's gonna write a program that I wouldn't thought of. And it's really good at predicting what I would do next, but it doesn't really write new stuff. The reason what AlphaGo played differently is because it was trained just to play. It wasn't told how, and it figured out slightly differently than the humans play. This one, ChatGPT at the moment, the technology might change, but at the moment, it's just trained, it's called statistical parrot. It's just trained to mimic the patterns that it sees. But that may change in the future.
Sorry, I'll just add one last thing there. The other thing that I think is actually great about these things that are coming out is every single problem that we solve is a demonstration. It helps us to define what intelligence actually means as humans. Like, there are lots of things. When I was a kid, anybody who could solve a Rubik's Cube was unbelievable, smartest kid in the class. Until 5 or 6 years later, you realise there's an algorithm behind it, and you watch the videos where people are doing it blindfolded or behind their back or whatever, and you go, oh, that's not a definition of intelligence. So it helps us to parameterize, contain what are the things that actually define us as intelligent beings, and and these day-to-day tasks that we often cherish as like examples of immense intelligence. It allows us to move around them and go, oh, actually, there's a real clear pattern to how we actually solve those problems, and then we can really concentrate on what makes us more human to some degree. Probably sounds a bit lofty and that thing, but that's where I see these things actually really helping. So.
I got a couple more questions on from the ether. A couple of them are very complicated and would take a long time to answer, so we might have a brief afterwards where we record a couple of things. Here's one. It says, we're focusing on teaching, but are there some very powerful AI tools for us as researchers? Any comments?
I know of at least one colleague who's writing their papers through ChatGPT.
There you go.
In a positive way, I should say that in a very positive way. Using to stimulate how to write a particular section. So, obviously when we write papers, we've got page constraints, we've got style constraints to adhere to a journal and sort of thing, and they're using this to support their writing. So they're not doing the experiments or anything like that, but they are absolutely using it to help them write their reports and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a couple. So with ChatGPT itself, there's been a couple of experiments that people have done, like just anecdotal experiments where they tried to do a review of some scientific literature or something like that, and it hasn't really worked. Meta, Facebook, tried to release a chatbot that was trained on just a whole bunch of scientific literature, and people very quickly broke it and got it to produce made-up citations and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It may get better, I think. It'll
People
probably
are
get
working
better.
on provenance.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an interesting problem here. If you give a student 5 things to read and then say write an essay, then everything in the essay you can say which thing did it come from, because they've only read 5 things. This thing's read millions of things. So in a sense, there isn't a fact of the matter about where something came from. So in provenance, what you're kind of saying is, could you find a reference that says what I just said? It's not where did this come from. So it's just, it's a challenging problem.
There's also other areas where, for example, if you think about machine learning itself, the application of machine learning is often very fraught with tuning of parameters to make the models fit better to the data you've got. And I know of at least one case here where somebody actually used ChatGPT on some rather complex modelling to actually say, help me, I'm struggling with the modelling of this particular approach. And ChatGPT was able to sort of interact and help with them to actually do that hyperparameter tuning. So, again, saving them having to read swathes of textbooks on this particular parameter on this particular paper for this particular problem, having to digest all of that, synthesize it, it's brought down so that they can actually solve the problem that they're trying to solve right now. So there's productivity elements.
It's really good for general explanation. If you like, I work in a very interdisciplinary area, and I'm constantly talking to these people and to lawyers and economists, and I need an explanation of this idea that I've just heard somebody explain. I don't want a technical explanation, but I need it pretty accurate and I need pretty good detail.
Yeah.
Brilliant for that.
And
So
it's-
helpful for that sort of thing.
It's really good at summary, so you can give it a piece of text and just give me a summary, and it's really good at fishing out all the information, and you can be pretty sure that it's mostly correct because it's just summarizing the text. That's there.
Or differences. How does this one differ from that
That's
one?
right.
It's good at that
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
And this comes back to how do we teach our students to be better users of it, and as researchers, how do we be better at it? When we look at things that we put into ChatGPT and so forth that we are experts in, we can do a pretty good sniff test on that summary that comes back. It's like, no, that doesn't make sense because in my domain that just sounds really weird. So it's good for getting into a new environment, getting a quick summary of where we are, but actually, again, if we've got the skills to do that sniff test and go, well, that seems a bit out of character, and being able to validate and verify it through other means, it's a real boon for productivity. It really does help to really compact down what we actually have to focus on in terms of learning a new domain or a new application or so on.
I've just got one, this is a bugbear of mine, so I'm going to highlight it from the ether. So if in-person invigilation remains key for maintaining academic integrity for assessments, does this indirectly imply that the University of Otago should invest more in facilities for online digital in-person invigilated assessments, or should we stick to paper and pencil? So I'm not sure. So for online in general, absolutely not. It's doomed. That we cannot ensure, if students are doing it at home in their flat, we cannot ensure that they're actually doing it. We never could, and it's just a crazy assumption that was ever made. So those tools like ExamSoft, they're trivial to get around, and students have been getting around them since they've been used. If that means, does it mean we have computers in labs that students are sitting on and they're somehow cut off from the internet or whatever? Yeah, maybe. I mean, we do that in computer science, and if the particular skill requires using a computer, then sure. I don't see why not. Okay, how are we going for time?
Got a couple more.
Couple more. Any from the Richard? We haven't heard from you.
Kia ora, Brendan. Kia ora, panel. I'm interested to hear the panel's thoughts on. There's some really interesting intellectual property questions around ChatGPT and AI generally. One very basic one is, are they allowed to copy the internet in the first place, which will be the subject of law cases. But more specifically in the context of today's discussion, I'm interested in what you think about the concept of authorship. And, you know, with going back to the idea of engineering your prompt, whether our notion of authorship, you know, our whole knowledge system, at least in the Western ideology, is very individualistic. And it is, you know, it's me that did this and I am producing this thing. Is that notion going to change with AI because it's a more collective way of producing things? Grant's example of someone writing a paper. Some researchers already listed ChatGPT as a co-author on a paper that they submitted to Springer, and Springer had to come out and say, no, you can't do that. It's not a co-author because hasn't got an email address that we can put on the form, essentially. Anyway, so that's my sort of general question. So, you know, our students will be possibly producing less themselves. Mm-hmm. So is that something we need to grapple with, this notion of authorship?
In philosophy, we are telling students at the moment that ChatGPT is not a citable source. So the things in your reference list are citable sources. We expect you'll use ChatGPT and it might give you some good ideas. At some point, you can't cut and paste bits in and say, ChatGPT did this. But that's pedagogical. And out in the wider world, what are people going to use it for? I think it's going to be tremendous for lots of people for whom English isn't their first language. You know, smart people, but they just have more work to do than I have to write a report. Boom! Suddenly they can write a report in copybook English. It is that thing of what are we trying to get, and then in the research sense, what are we trying to credential, or what's the provenance that we're after? You know, if it's PBRF, then it's government wants to know how much work James did and Richard did, and sort of thing. So it's going to be hard to get away from that sort of atomistic model of knowledge. But this is a very interesting tool because it's very unatomistic. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you to the panellists. So I just have to wrap up because we're out of time. If you want to stay behind and have a brief chat, we're happy to talk to you about various things. But to close out, let me thank a few people. So thanks to the media production team for use of their facilities and their cameras, etc. For Russell and Bronwyn for organising it all, thank you. And to the panellists, of course, for your very insightful comments, I must say. And finally to the audience, both here and at home, I hope you enjoyed it and got a little bit out of it. And thanks for your questions. Whaia te maroranga he ranga mo kautu. Thank you, everybody.
Sure.